to today's meeting of the Audit and Scrutiny Committee. I'd like to begin with some preliminary issues regarding the conduct of the meeting as usual, to remind you that today is a hybrid meeting and we do have a couple of people joining us remotely. The meeting is being recorded and a copy of the recording will be made available on the Council's YouTube channel following the end of the meeting. To help with the smooth running of this afternoon's proceedings, if you are joining remotely, please mute your microphone when you're not speaking. Use the raise your hand function if you'd like to raise a question, and lower it again when you finish speaking, and avoid using the chat function for debate amongst one another. For those attending in person, please activate your microphone in the chamber when speaking and turn it off again when you've finished your contribution. Myself and the officers attending will monitor proceedings with a view to ensuring all requests to speak are seen. To introduce the officers attending this afternoon's meeting, we have Louise Pringle, Director of Business Operations and Partnerships, Margaret McCrossan, Head of Accountancy, Margaret's successor, Kirsty Stanners, Head of Finance. Welcome to your first Audit and Scrutiny Committee meeting. Glad to have you on board. We also have another new attendee in Ian McLean, Senior Internal Auditor. So welcome aboard. In addition to that, we have Linda Hutchison, Senior Democratic Services Officer, John Burke, Committee Services Officer, and Grace Scanlon from our external auditors. We have Michelle Blair, the Head of Internal Audit, joining us online also. Which brings us on to the agenda proper, item number 1, apologies for absence.
Yes, Chair, we have apologies from Provost Montague, Councillor Buchanan and Councillor MacDonald. Thank you.
All noted, thank you very much. Item 2, declarations of interest. The Council's Code of Conduct requires elected members to declare any financial or non-financial interests on any of the items in today's agenda. Are there any declarations to be made? There are no declarations to be made. Okay, thank you. Item 3 is my Chair's report. So just an update for your information, as was the case last year. Prior to summer recess, Rob Jones of the External Audit Team wrote to me in my capacity as Chair of this committee regarding auditing standards and a letter of representation which was required to be made. This is part of the external audit process and allows them to update their understanding of our arrangements for oversight of management processes and arrangements on an annual basis. He posed various questions to me, for example, on how we exercise oversight of management processes for identifying and responding to risk, the risk of fraud and possible breaches of internal controls. I've drafted and sent a formal response to this letter. On another aspect regarding external audit, I have a meeting scheduled for the 20th of August with Rob Jones, again from Ernst & Young, and I will report back on the outcome of that meeting. Are there any comments on my report? No. Okay. Moving on, item 4, I'd like to invite the clerk now to speak on an update on the breakfast cart service at Neilston Primary School. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. So further to the meeting in June, this report asks the committee to note clarification provided to members on the breakfast cart service at Neilston Primary School.
Okay, that's super. Thank you very much. So the update is obviously noted in the papers. The Chief Accountant did provide some feedback in that this service will be funded for the remainder of the 24-25 school session about to start, and a review will be undertaken during the course of this school term to measure the impact of the expenditure. Now, I think it is simply worth noting that there was a national policy commitment which was to be delivered on in August 2022, which would fund the provision of free breakfast for all primary pupils. And I don't know what the exact mechanism for that is sitting in this chair, but I would like to find out if there's likely to be any progress on that in the coming year, because this was a national policy commitment by the Government of Scotland, and this is potentially, the service would be continued, but we would perhaps receive dedicated funding to do so. So I simply wanted to put that observation on the record, and I see that Councillor Bollis has raised his hand.
Thanks, Chair. Just on that, I mean, it's encouraging to note that the devolved school management reserve for Neilston has increased from 20,000 to 58,000. over the last year, which is good news. But I just wonder what that figure of 58,000, would it be significantly more had we had these funds from Scottish Government? So I wonder if we can actually put a value on what this means to schools, that they are actually, to what extent they are having to fund. What's the kind of bottom line, if you like? Thanks.
Thank you for that question, Councillor Willis. And I think it also speaks to what's going on in other primary schools elsewhere within the authority. I appreciate I'm a ward member, which covers Neilston, but sitting in this chair of the committee, there's an overall remit across the whole authority. So I think that point has been noted, and it's on the record for further consideration at a later point.
Sorry, can I just, are you wanting us to check what the current position on that is? Is
that would be helpful, yes, to pick up the point Councillor Bollis raised in terms of what would the devolved school management budget be for that specific school had the national policy commitment had been delivered on.
Just to use that as an example.
And I appreciate we're speaking in terms of one school at the moment, but there are many schools within the remit of the council. So, okay, noting all that. Oh, sorry, Councillor Ireland has a hand raised. Councillor Ireland.
Thank you very much, Chair. Yeah, it was really good news seeing this, that it's going to carry on in Neilston, but I'll echo what you've both just said. I also would like to know the current provision, and note that there were several schools that got the breakfast card. I'm unsure whether that's going to continue in all the schools that got trialled, or is this going to be expanded, or I know we're just talking about Neilston today, but yes, an update on the current provision would be exceptionally helpful. I know there is some work being done by the Scottish Government, but again, I would welcome more information on that as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Ireland. I actually did take the liberty of researching this a little myself, and my understanding is that the Scottish Government is currently carrying out a mapping exercise, or that concluded, I should say, in June, to establish where provision already exists within Scotland. So hopefully that information would be readily available for the purposes we are seeking it for in this committee. So thank you. Are there any further comments to be added to this, or are we quite happy to note it and move on? Okay, I've not seen any further requests to speak, so let's move on. The next item on the agenda is item 5, the annual Treasury Management Report for the year 23-24. Margaret, I believe you're picking this up.
Thanks, Chair. Normally it would be Barbara Clark, our Chief Accountant, who's giving this report, but as she's on leave, I'll be taking you through it today. You'll know that we are required to report on our treasury management operations, not just at year end, but 4 times throughout the year, and these reports always come to Audit and Scrutiny. But this is the year end one for 23-24. It's a really high level report, and it's just showing the Council's debt position mainly for the year that's finished. And in it we explain why the borrowing that we actually undertook during the year was different from that we forecast when we set our plans a year earlier. The report also goes through the various prudential indicators and other indicators which we have to measure our treasury management performance against. The first thing, though, is the borrowing. This is the big ticket item. When we set our budget for 23-24, we anticipated that we'd have to borrow £58 million to support our general fund capital plans. However, due to rescheduling of capital projects, i.e. delaying them to future years or slippage in existing projects, and also due to the high interest rates that were continuing on the market, we did not undertake any new borrowing during the year, and we've reported to you a number of times that was going to be our strategy. We were going to delay borrowing as long as we possibly could and use internal funds to fund our capital temporarily until rates came down, and then we would begin to pick up our borrowing again. So that's the reason for the big differences there. And then moving on to the various indicators, that we measure our Treasury management against. We set those again February, March 2023, and as far as the risk indicators are concerned, we set ourselves a measure that we should not have variable rate loans making up more than 15% of our total debt, and that's just to protect us from great changes in the interest rates. And we're well within that, because in the last year, the highest level of variable debt that we've had has been 7.38% of our total debt. I think in future years this is likely to reduce further as we start taking on our normal borrowing again, because our normal borrowing is taken at fixed rates. Also on the risk side, we also protect ourselves against the risk of large chunks of our debt maturing at any one time and us having to replace debt at a time when maybe interest rates aren't favourable. So we say that no more than 15% of our debt should come to maturity at any one point. And again, we've projected out over the coming years and we're within that for all the future years. Then you hear us talking about the prudential indicators. They're set out in the report and they cover our capital investment plans and treasury management decisions and make sure that those are affordable, prudent and sustainable. On page 4, you'll see the operational boundary and authorised limits for external debt and how we measure against those. And in actual performance, we're operating well within these limits. So we're not borrowing anything like as much as the maximum allowed amounts that would be possible. Also, you'll see that the amount of movement between the capital financing reserve and our gross debt, that indicates that there is a need for internal borrowing, i.e. we don't plan to take all our borrowing externally. We're going to use our internal balances to avoid going out into the market. We planned using our internal borrowing of about 51 million, but due to delaying the external borrowing, we've actually increased the amount of reliance on internal borrowing to 60 million in 23-24. The final set of indicators are on debt performance, and our average loans pool fund rate was just under the Scottish average rate for 22-23, and our average borrowing rate for 23-24 reduced by 0.07%. But I wouldn't say that this trend will continue. This trend is likely to go in the other direction in future because interest rates are nowhere near the historic lows that we enjoyed over the last 10 years or so. So, in short, our indicators are all in line, or we're living within those set a year ago. And the last element of the report asks that you approve the list of counterparties. That's in Appendix 8, and it's just where we've got our own surplus funds. We invest them in places that are safe, and we haven't really made any changes to those lists. But again, every quarter we just ask you to reiterate that those are the approved sources that we can deal with for our investments. And I'd be happy to take any questions.
Okay. Thank you very much for that report, Margaret. Are there any questions on this? I have Councillor Edlin and Councillor Island.
It would seem to me as an amateur at this that it seems almost prudent to borrow less. And I mean, you've shown that borrowing less externally and more internally leads to better performance in terms of the numbers compared to other councils and safe financial and prudent management. If that were to be continued on a longer term basis, it would certainly, I would think, show better financial, easier cash management, etc. But I wonder how you decide when it's safe to expand borrowing and expand projects and when you shouldn't, and how you're guided in that.
Okay, there's a number of questions there. I'll try and pick them all up. You can come back to me at the end if I've missed anything. Our capacity for internal borrowing depends how much resource we have, both on a day-to-day basis and longer term in our reserves. So as long as our reserves are relatively high, then we can use them for internal borrowing. But if we're using our reserves for other purposes, then eventually they'll come down and we won't have the same scope for the internal borrowing, and we have to look externally. So we constantly have a review of how much our reserves are before we determine whether we borrow externally or internally. And we also have our Treasury Management consultants who we meet with every quarter to check that we are taking the best line on that, and they'll give us an opinion on the direction of travel for interest rates too, and whether there are good investments coming up. So we look at that as far as those are concerned. I think that covers the restrictions on borrowing internally, because we've got to make sure that if we've got a huge creditors run or a big backdated pay award, we've got to have enough cash available at relatively short notice to pay those. So we can't commit all our cash balances into supporting the capital plan. But our Treasury function plan well ahead for these things, and that's why we've tended to, any investments we do make, external ones, we're limiting to a maximum of 6 months, and if possible, we don't usually invest for more than a week, just so that we can be flexible in terms of getting our hands on our money if we need it at short term. So I hope that makes a bit of sense. I don't know if I've answered all your questions or if there's anything I've missed.
Does that assure you, Councillor?
No, it answers the questions, but it just raises a question of what level is prudent capital spending. At what level should that be set at then, based on the benefits you've just stated earlier in terms of having less borrowings externally at this point?
Thanks. And you had missed one element of it. I just couldn't remember what it was. How do we determine what the overall safe level of capital investment is? There's an unofficial rule of thumb that you should keep your debt repayments on your borrowing to no more than, say, 10 or 12% of your revenue expenditure. So if our annual revenue expenditure is taken as 100%, it's good practice to keep your loan charge repayments on your borrowing less than 10% of that. Now, in recent years, we've been about somewhere over 6%. Over the next 4 to 5 years, if we go forward with our capital plans that are set out in our 10-year capital plan, we're projecting that loan charge repayment stream will take up somewhere just over 9%, so within the 10%, but certainly a bigger pressure on our revenue budget than it has been, and we would be looking at that 10% to 12% as, you know, a sort of ceiling or a restriction on the amount of capital investment that we can afford to pay for.
So, Councillor Edlin, I was just clarifying that measurement can actually be seen on page 11. It's the second prudential indicator, which says financing to net revenue stream, sitting at 6.6%. So you can see the history of it over the course of the year. Councillor Ireland, your question?
Thank you, Chair. My question is quite similar to Councillor Edlin's. It was that I know we've always been quite ambitious with our capital plans, and I noted that Margaret was saying that this is going to be a temporary position with the no new borrowing. So my question really was, are there plans to move towards where we were before and return to a sort of a normal borrowing, so to speak? Or is that something, I think Margaret may have answered it, in that it's not something that's going to be looked at in the short term. I imagine this is now we're into next year's budget to look at this, and I just wanted a wee bit of clarity if that would be the case.
Yes, the answer to that one is it's quite simple. Yes, we will be moving back to our normal practice, which is taking on external borrowing. It's always just been a question of when, and two things were driving that: the availability, the ongoing availability of resources to support internal borrowing, and the external availability of decent interest rates on the market. Now, as you'll know, just in the last month, we've had the first chink of light and the first slight reduction in interest rates. So we will be looking at the market, and once our Treasury advisors tell us there are good deals out there for the length of borrowing that we want to take, then we'll go in there and we'll gradually work our way back up again in the external borrowing. Because our internal borrowing is obviously means that we've got less and less internal resource left to borrow from. So these two factors mean that we would always be looking to revert to normality whenever we can.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'll be happy to accept the recommendations.
Just one thing. A lot of what we've been discussing here, I think we discussed last May with the National External Audit Report on loans, etc. But I do recall at that point, in which, as McCrossan, you mentioned about, it's not so much capital spend, such as the new leisure centre, and I remember raising that as to whether it was concerned that these capital projects on their own is not necessarily the problem, because we also have what you refer to as the underlying general capital pressures for things like IT, long-term maintenance upgrades, roof replacements, boiler upgrades, and particularly for the net zero projects that we will be looking at. And I did raise my concerns, which you've referred to earlier on, about the level of borrowing against what our whole budget is. And as you're saying, 6.6% just now, and that's going to raise to over 9%. And when I raised that with the external auditor from Ernst & Young last time, she did mention about how everything's based on a kind of risk-based assessment, and she had classified our financial sustainability as red risk. So it's just within that backdrop that we don't know what, particularly when we come to the net zero stuff, to what extent are we going to be pushed down that road beyond what the funds that we have available. So really, to say, we do seem to be teetering on the edge of the absolute maximum, and there's a number of unknowns around the corner. Just to make that point, thanks.
Yeah, I can maybe come in on that one before Grace does. Hopefully she'll back me up on this one. But I think all councils have got a red financial risk assessment. The way that the overall position is in the economy at the moment. So that's not unique to ourselves. But yes, there is an underlying pressure for not just new projects, but for the day-to-day stuff too. And that's really before we go too much further with some of the eye-watering numbers that we could be looking at in future for Get to Zero. I think it's not realistic that we could fund the huge demands that Get to Zero will place on us without additional funding, and certainly we are petitioning, as every other council in Scotland is, for some sort of financial support or capital input to allow us to meet the Get to Zero targets, because it's not something we can fund ourselves.
If I could throw a question at the mix myself, Margaret, in terms of that finance into net revenue stream, which the last few speakers have been referring to, So we're at 6.6% just now. I believe you said that 12% is the kind of the threshold at which we would say we would try to stay under 12%. Is that 12% kind of changeable based on the cost of borrowing? So when interest rates are low, you can have a higher amount of debt and it's cheaper to finance, it's cheaper, it's more affordable. But as the cost of borrowing has increased, and perhaps 15% would be too much, maybe. Yeah. Is 12% reflective of that? Is the question.
The 10 to 12% hasn't been varied. It's just seen as that is what is affordable without squeezing your revenue budget too far. Mm-hmm. If interest rates were much higher, mm-hmm. then it's basically saying you can afford to do less capital.
Yes.
So that's a limiting factor on it. So it's not an absolute mm-hmm. Measure, but it doesn't change depending on interest rates. But obviously if interest rates do go up, then it's more of a squeeze.
Okay, now that makes sense. Councillor Bollas, yeah.
Yes, just to clarify, I seem to recall at our May meeting that the figure of 10% was the guideline and 12% was the absolute worst case scenario. I think you'll find that quoted. Okay, thanks.
Okay, and thank you for reminding the committee of that. So, with no further requests to speak, we're happy to accept the recommendations of the report and approve the list of counterparties in Appendix 8. Yeah. Okay, thank you for that. So, item 6 is a review of a national external audit report on local government budgets for the year 24-25. I think Linda is going to introduce this item before Margaret speaks.
Yeah, so this report refers to the Audit Scotland report on local government budgets 24-25, and it's Councillor Morrison who's reading on this under the specialisation arrangements. As you say, Head of Accounts has provided feedback and she's at the meeting today if you want her to comment further or answer any questions on that. Thank you. Thank you
very much, Linda. Is there any, do you want to introduce the subject at all, Margaret? Or?
I can do.
Yeah.
This is a new report for our committee. It's the first time the Accounts Commission have published this type of briefing on councillors' current year council's current year budgets, but they do intend to do this annually in future. So this is a report that I think will develop and be brought back every year by the Accounts Commission. It just sets out a high-level summary again of the varying main issues and increasing financial pressures that face Scottish councils when they're setting their budgets, and in particular when they were setting their budgets for 24-25. As with these reports that we get, almost all of the points raised are relevant to East Renfrewshire Council, and I've provided various comments on our situation where that was appropriate in my comments on the report. But in particular, the report notes that it's difficult to get a clear understanding of some councils' budget plans because of the way their budget information is set out in the public reports when they hold their council meetings to set their budgets. But I think also in the information that they provide to their external auditors too, the level of detail that's provided. As members will be aware, from the recent council meeting, we provide a very large amount of detail in our annual budget papers, and we believe that we demonstrate transparency. But the approach does vary significantly across Scotland, and this has obviously limited the scope for like-for-like comparisons between the councils. And the Accounts Commission have said in the report that they hope that councils will adopt a more consistent approach in future to allow them to make easier comparisons in subsequent annual briefings. So I'm quite happy to take any questions on the report.
That's very helpful, thank you, Margaret. In terms of leading on the report, I did read the Audit Scotland report in detail myself, and I also did note that inconsistency that you remarked on, Margaret, in terms of how some councils are approaching this. I think it was Highland Council in particular, for example, hadn't provided any analysis of the sources of savings made, so they were all basically lumped into other, which kind of somewhat skewed the figures, especially when local authorities are hoping to benchmark themselves to elsewhere using that report. So it is the first year, and hopefully in future years it will be a little more consistent and comparable. One point I did note is on paragraph 10 of the appendix here, that councils hope to raise some £1.3 billion each year from fees and charges, and members may be aware that the visitor levy has now been brought into existence, and it's there as something which local authorities can bring into use, and there are particular local authorities already considering that. And I suppose the concern I would raise is that my own personal opinion is I don't see what benefit there would be to a visitor levy in East Renfrewshire, because we just don't have that kind of local economy. We're not that kind of demographic of council. For other places, though, such as Perth and Ross, Glasgow, Edinburgh, those big urban councils, it could be a way of them generating extra revenue. But my concern is, does that then, justify further cuts from central funding for local authorities? Because in that position, we would not be able to potentially make up for that lost revenue, because our income from charges like that would be negligible. So that is a concern that I have on the horizon. Does anyone else have any questions or observations to make? I see Councillor Wallace has his hand straight up.
Yeah.
I'll take Councillor Ireland after.
Yeah, just to say, you mentioned Highland and the figures that they had brought forward, and as we know, they haven't been without their difficulties in recent years. However, the Accounts Commission, when they're looking for information from individual councils, do they specifically lay down the criteria of how these numbers should come through? And because you have mentioned about the inconsistency, you said so yourself, Chair, and you confirmed this also. So as I say, is there criteria there that we have to follow, that each council has to follow, which certain councils are not doing so? Thanks.
I don't think there's anything formal. I wouldn't be at all surprised if in future years we're given a bit more direction of what is required. But my understanding, again, I'm looking at Grace to keep me right, is that the information that they use to compile these reports is not gained directly from councils, but instead from councils' external auditors. So it's what councils' external auditors have been able to pick up from their client councils.
Perhaps just come back and so I was just going to say, and you might be able to comment on this at the same time, which is that if the Accounts Commission, as you said yourself, are insisting on greater consistency, how can they do that unless external auditors are pushing for that information? Thanks.
Okay, Chair, for me to respond to that. So the first point around about the returns. So they do ask external auditors to fill in a return. Obviously, as a matter of course, then we get that checked by the council officers just to make sure that they're content with it. But the key point for us is that we don't ever want to put something in the public domain that isn't already there. So, and I think that's the Commission's point around about, particularly where it is some of the things that will be in detailed papers, but not necessarily in the full council papers, like assumptions around about cost pressures in the future. So that percentage that individual councils are using, because often that's part of really detailed scenario planning that you'll have in your cross-party working groups, but not in public at council meetings. So, so that's, I guess, why there is that variation. But I think we really welcome that them setting out these expectations here, because that gives us something to mark against, I guess, and to make sure there is that clarity across the country. Does that answer?
Yeah. No,
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to note for the committee's understanding, within the appendix, paragraph 12, it begins in Exhibit 5 of the report, East Renfrewshire's gaps of 8.3 million in 25-26 and 2.2 million in 25-26. That latter figure should read as 26-27. So just for the avoidance of doubt. Which takes us on to Councillor Ireland.
Thank you very much, Chair. I've got a couple of questions. The first one is, yes, I welcome the call for consistency. I actually think that's a really good idea, and I hope to see that move forward. The report also talked about the need for improved transparency. And the report says, even within individual councils, the way in which budget papers are presented means the elected members and communities cannot easily determine the impact of budget decisions. So the paper then goes on to say that ERC will work with our external auditors to consider any further local improvements which may be suggested in that regard. My question on that was going to be, will this work be reported back to ourselves in the Audit and Scrutiny Committee when that takes place? And my second question was, I noted that, and I think Margaret made mention of it, one of only 6 councils, well, no, I'm not sure. We were only one of 6 councils who did not consult with residents in the year prior to setting the 24-25 budget. I'm interested to know, and I know that might not be able to be answered today, but are we planning any public consultation ahead of next year's budget? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Margaret, are you able to pick up some of the points there?
I've been quite careful. I was quite careful what I said about the transparency. I believe that we are one of the most transparent councils, and I said that if anything is raised with our external auditors, if they find there are some areas where they think we could improve our transparency, we'll consider that and work with them. I don't think we are one of the councils who maybe has the furthest to go on that one, but we're always open to working to improve. So that's the first element. The second element, sorry.
It was around public consultation.
Public consultation. Again, I did comment. The report lists us as one of 6 authorities who did not go out to public consultation for 24/5, and I actually object to that. I don't think that's. I think they're making us a broad statement, and it's factually correct that we did not go out in the previous 12 months, but we did a 3-year public consultation, a huge, very extensive consultation covering the 3-year period, 23/4, 24/5, 25/6, with over £30 million of proposals, which was a huge, huge exercise. We did that in October 2022. So all the savings that are on the table at the moment for consideration have already been out and subject to extensive public consultation. So that's why we didn't go out in the previous 12 months, because we'd already carried out a huge exercise. If we have new savings, which the public has never seen, then obviously in future we would have to consult with stakeholders on that. But at the moment, the only reason that we didn't do it is we'd already done it in autumn 2022.
Thank you. That makes sense. Grace, is there anything that you want to add in terms of the external audit piece of it and the consistency of reporting to Audit Scotland?
Yeah, so as I was saying earlier, then we really welcome that, the setting out of the expectations. But budget monitoring reports and the budget, the clarity, I suppose, of the budget is something that we look at every year as part of our work, particularly on financial management, and certainly we didn't have any comments on that last year. And probably just a little bit of reassurance for Margaret. I've just double-checked the return that we sent in, and we did refer to that significant budget consultation exercise, and that it covered the 3 years, when we submitted our return. So I guess that we've acknowledged that that has happened to cover the savings that are in the budget for this year. So that was all.
Thank you very much. I mean, do correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding was that 3-year review period was supposed to align with, I think it was the Scottish Government 3-year long-term forecast as well, and I don't know if that quite materialised because of I think the Verity House agreement got in the way of it, perhaps. Does that ring any bells with you?
I think at the time we thought we would have multi-year budgets, but for any number of national and international reasons, that has not been possible, and so would be a bit out of sync with that.
Yeah, no, indeed. I knew there was a rationale at the time discussed. Are there any new questions or new points that people would like to raise on this? No? Okay, but happy to accept the report. Yeah. And thank you so much, Margaret, for the detailed report and the answers at this afternoon's meeting. So that takes us on to the next item on the agenda, which is the implementation progress for Q1 of the audit plan for 24-25. And I'd like to invite Ian McLean to speak to this. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Chair. It's really nice to be with you here today. Yeah, so far we haven't issued any audit reports relating to planned 24-25 audit work just yet, as in this first quarter to 30th of June, most of our audit time was spent completing 23-24 audits, and you'll see details of these in Appendix 3. We have issued one 24-25 audit since then, and another few are just about ready to be issued, so we're making quite good progress there. There's been no significant findings in the reports issued in the quarter, although there is still a common theme in some of the audits that access to systems should be removed a wee bit more quickly than we're seeing at times. We've also completed 2 follow-up reports, which have already been circulated to members. There's really good progress in both of these in implementing previous recommendations. As noted in the covering report on page 29, there's been 3 items which have been reviewed using contingency so far this year. All of these are ongoing at the moment. One of them was quite a large piece of work, and like the other 2, it's still ongoing but nearing completion as work continues on it. Appendix 4 shows progress against our current indicators, where we're currently meeting all of our targets at the moment. And subject to any questions, the committee is asked to note Internal Audit's progress report for the quarter, and please indicate if you wish any reports to be circulated at this time.
Thank you very much, Ian. I'd like to open with questions, which is on the council tax billing and collection audit. So that's page 33 of the papers. Recommendation 4.1.1. With regards to that council tax suspense account, I mean, are you able to give us an indication of the extent of the balance on that? Is it quite an immaterial balance? Is it a larger balance?
Yeah, yes, I can. In total, at the moment, there's just over 89,000 in that suspense account. That's going back quite a number of years. It's a very, very small percentage of the actual council tax collected. I think it's like 0.03%. I'm informed just now, so it's very, very small. And we continue to work on those to try and identify where these payments can be allocated as much as we can.
That's super, thank you. And how would a payment from a council taxpayer end up being, posted to the suspense account? As the payment cannot be identified as to which account it relates to, or as there perhaps a communications piece of work that needs to be done to ensure taxpayers are paying correctly and these funds are going to the right place?
Yeah, sure. Louise can keep me right a wee bit on this one, but yeah, a lot of the time it will be a misquoted reference number. Sometimes people won't quote a reference at all, particularly on online payments which people can make now, almost direct into their bank accounts. These can cause us some issues. But without hopefully not boring you too much, but there's 2 ways that payments can be caught. They can be caught initially that there's either no reference number or it doesn't fit, so we catch them in a first kind of net of suspense. If they're the right format, they then go forward to the council tax system itself, but then the council tax system will say, that's the right format, that number, but I don't recognise that as a viable number. So that's the 2 places that they often get caught. And a lot of the time, if there's no other detail available, we're really stuck. We can't really do anything unless someone comes forward with a receipt and says, that's mine, by the way. But we do try. The team work very hard, and if they see regular payments coming in at regular times, we at times will contact the bank and try to say, look, is there a way of contacting that customer to try and resolve that issue? So we try our best.
That's very reassuring, Ian. Thank you very much. I think for any residents who are watching this, they can know that the council's doing everything it possibly can to allocate those payments to the correct place and return them if appropriate. Are there any questions from members at all on, Councillor Wallace?
Not so much a question, but just to welcome Ian McLean. You mentioned you're about to apologise for seemingly appearing boring. You want to appreciate that our boredom threshold, this is the Audit and Scrutiny Committee, where it's much higher than many others. And you're now, I think, in Hotel California, and that you're not allowed to leave.
Thank you very much for that. Councillor Ireland.
Thank you very much, Chair. I have a question on a latter part of the paper. Am I all right to ask that at this moment? Or are we moving forward through it?
That's a question in any item in Agenda 7.
Oh, okay.
That's
fantastic. I've got a question on it's an item that's on page 35, 36, and it's comments on the city deal. I note that what it states in the paper is a review of the costs being allocated to each of the categories available showed the overall allocation of internal council management external consultants had exceeded the original amount, or the original budget amount. And there was some recommendations made in that to look at sort of reprofiling this. No such reprofiling taking place, but my question around that is that I'm overall very concerned about the budget for the works. In particular, I'm talking about the Ors Road works. I spotted in the next Cabinet papers that there's mention of some issues that have been encountered with ground conditions, and delays will extend the length of the construction period and delay the opening of the new road. Because we're talking about the budget here, I wanted to know if information will be provided to this committee on the effects of that delay, especially programme timetable to reopen, and importantly costs associated with the work. Is that something we can touch on as part of this paper, or something that will come to us?
I don't know if perhaps Michelle or Ian, one of you, would like to pick up in terms of the City Deal projects from an audit point of view, because obviously we're looking here at the audit testing which has been carried out on that, and I suppose the question that's coming through there is, are the systems that are in place sufficient to identify the reasons for budget overspend, and if a project's running behind, that's a longer period of time which contractors are being paid, workers are being paid, that will lead to a budget overspend. So is there some sort of input that audit could give us on that, or perhaps it may be useful to send us the full audit findings so we can look for ourselves?
Sorry, I can comment on it. The audit is usually just focusing on looking at what we've actually claimed in since the previous audit. We don't necessarily look at like delays as such, but it's maybe something we could look at next year when we do it.
Yes, Margaret?
Yeah, normally the impact of delays would be reported in the first instance through the quarterly capital monitoring reports. There we flag up any changes in the expected pattern of capital expenditure for each project. So within the City Deal section in the roads page of our capital monitoring report, we would be flagging up if we expected the timing of expenditure to change or the overall total, and wherever possible the aim is to keep the overall cost of projects the same without going up, so you'd be trying to claw back any excesses elsewhere within either the project or elsewhere in City Deal or elsewhere within the Council's capital programme. But as I say, I would look for that. If there's anything to report there, the first place you'll see it will probably be in the capital monitoring reports.
Okay.
Thank you.
Any further follow-up point on that, Councillor Ireland?
I'm going to keep that's good to know what to keep an eye on moving forward, because it is something that concerns me. I think it might end up coming in some form before us, given that there is a delay at the moment. So I'll just keep an eye out for that paper coming through. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's something that I'm quite mindful of myself with a audit hat on. At the last full council, I did of course ask a question of relevant officers in terms of the timescale and whether we're still on track for getting the road reopened as scheduled, and members will be aware that there was an article in the local media 3 or 4 weeks subsequent to that. So there is a question mark there. I did note that report at the forthcoming cabinet, and we'll have more information in the progression of time. Councillor Edlin, raise your hand.
I think Councillor Ireland's point is well made. Can there be comments about the staffing levels at City Deal? Because I believe that they've not been replacing staff and their budget for staff has gone down. Does that affect any of this?
I can't speak to the veracity of that, but I'm not sure if...
I don't know if our officials can.
Is this a point that you could respond to just now? Or?
Are you referring to the overall City Deal Glasgow City region, or the local? It's really our local officers who manage the City Deal who are monitoring it locally. I'm not aware of
I may have
big changes.
misunderstood that. I may have misunderstood what I was told before. Perhaps I should just agree with Councillor Ireland and leave it at that until I get more information.
I think that, as Councillor Ireland said, the delays in City Deal, I don't think it's to do with staffing levels. I think it's to do with ground conditions in this instance. I'm not aware of staffing levels being an issue that impacts on the timing of the City Deal.
Councillor Wallace.
Yeah, it's interesting that this should come up again. You might recall, probably about a year ago now, that the Environment Department came in front of the Audit and Scrutiny Committee, and this was to do with poor contingencies being put into projects and overspends, etc. as a result. And I dare say this will come back to, we might find with the Ors Road project, did we put sufficient contingencies in, given, if there's ground conditions? I mean, there is a whacking great band of water around there, which may cause a few problems. I dare say obviously all that stuff's taken into consideration. But again, just to say, we have raised this before, so hopefully it's not something that's going to reoccur. We'll find out in due course. Thanks.
But my understanding is that surveys are carried out before these projects go ahead, so one would think that contingencies would be made for items identified in the survey. I saw your finger hovering over the microphone there, Margaret. I'm not sure if there's anything that you wanted to add to this.
It was just to say I do recall that item, and I think that was where we had a large number of different projects all trying to be delivered at once, and maybe that meant the staff were stretched too thinly. I remember now that was the issue, but I think for this one, this is a very high profile project, and it tends to be our more experienced staff who are involved in this one. I don't think that's an impact on this one. There's no one from property here. We can maybe double check that, but I think that's a slightly different scenario.
Okay. Wanted to bring conversation back on track somewhat here, because the item that we're looking at here are the audit report findings. I would say that there has been quite a lot of discussion around Audit 1206 on the City Deal. I think it would be quite good if that one was circulated to members of the committee for further reading, and that may help allay some concerns that have been raised. Are there any questions on any of the other audits before us in this report? I'll be happy to accept the report. Okay, on that basis, that brings us to the end of this afternoon's business. Thank you much for your attendance, and I'll see you next time. Thank you. Cheers.